Minutes before my daughter's wedding. I overheard her groom calling her used-up trash. He thought I'd stay silent. He was wrong. I did not go looking for sin. It found me in the side corridor of St. Francis. In that chill pocket of stone, where the organ's hymn softened to a hush, and the smell of old wood mixed with lilies, I had stepped away to breathe. To keep my hands from shaking as my daughter fastened her veil. As guests murmured about how beautiful the day was, and what a fine young man she had chosen. I had raised Emily on this soil. On prayers and sore muscles and early harvests. I believed in what you could touch and tally. Love, I told her. Nothing should stand up under daylight, the way a fence line stands under wind. I stopped beside the groom's room because I heard laughter. Not the warm kind that forgives. The hard kind that cuts. The door was cracked. I did not mean to listen. But the words came anyway. Slick and hateful. Used up trash. His voice. Ben's. My future son-in-law. He said it like he was spitting out a bad taste. I felt the beads of my rosary bite my palm. Another man chuckled and told him not to worry. That the mother-in-law's estate would make any night bearable. Glasses clinked. Men laughed. Something inside me tilted and did not right itself. Used up trash. He was talking about my child. You can tell yourself to be calm. You can tell yourself to walk away. But the body keeps its own counsel. My breath went small and sharp. I pressed closer to the wood as though I could push my disgust through it and choke him. Instead, I stood there and learned the shape of his greed. The Chestnut Grove name. He said. The ranch. Her mother's bank numbers. He could tolerate anything for that. I thought of Emily on the other side of the church. Lipstick fresh. The same brave smile she wore at 8 when kids on the bus called her names, and I told her they were wrong. I thought of my husband's headstone. Of the promises I had made to a man already in the earth. Take care of our girl. Keep her safe. Keep the land whole. I had done both by staying busy and keeping faith. I knew how to run a crew. Read a ledger. Negotiate a shipping rate. I knew how to cut rot out of a tree and leave it living. I did not know how to pull rot out of a man. I went to Emily. I sent the others out. I used the calm voice I saved for bad news about storms or cattle or bank calls. She looked at me like I was trying to steal her joy. Laura stood beside her and tilted the scales with soft words and little knives. It will ruin her day. Aunt Audrey. Are you afraid to let her go? That was how it began. The story about me being controlling and cruel. They walked her down the aisle on a lie and called it love. At the reception, the fairy lights glowed. People who had known me 20 years drank and laughed. Ben shook hands like a politician and thanked the caterer for the mole. He touched Emily's lower back, and the gesture looked so practiced, I thought my heart would split. I did not make a scene. I watched. I counted. Watching is a kind of prayer when you no longer have words you trust. A few days later, the whispers started in town. Difficult. Bitter. Made up stories to break them apart. I found patience at the market when what I wanted was a fight. I kept my head down and went home to my books and my dirt. Then I went to see Emily and found her signing pages she had not read. Ben called it routine. He smiled at me and did not blink. I smiled back and asked for water. When the bathroom door shut and he stepped out to take a call, I moved. You can say a woman like me is not trained for this. Maybe not. But I built a life by seeing through fog. I know what words matter. Power of attorney. Confession of judgment. Mortgage of assets. UCC. My eyes stung. I took photos of every page. I put them back as they were. When Emily came out, I told her I loved her and left before my voice could betray me. That night I sent the files to Victor. He has been our lawyer since my father had both knees. He does not scare easy. In the morning, he looked me in the face and told me the truth. If Emily kept signing, Ben could stand in our name. Take on debt we did not consent to. And hang it around our neck like a millstone. If his business failed, the bank would come to my yard. I held the edge of his desk, so I would not float away. People think the worst pain is betrayal. It is not. It is imagining what will happen to people who depend on you when you cannot stop the water. My crew. Men with sunburnt necks who grew up with my daughter. Women who pack fruit with careful hands. Truckers who show up on time because I pay on time. I saw them all. And I saw the gates chained and a notice pasted in bright paper that means go. We would not scare Ben yet. Victor said. We would gather. We would be quiet as foxes. He gave me a card. A private investigator named Isaac. If anyone can find proof, he can. Proof. Not anger. Not rumor. Paper. Photos. Audio. Chain of custody. Words that stand up in court. I walked out past the statue of blind justice and felt the first clean breath I had taken since the church hallway. I am a praying woman. But I am also a woman who understands procedures. Hope is not a plan. A plan is a plan. Mine began on a napkin at a coffee shop with Isaac while the waitress topped off our cups. He asked plain questions and did not waste my time. Where does Ben go? Who does he see? What bank? What car? Names. Dates. I told him everything I knew and the parts I suspected. He took the napkin and folded it like something worth keeping. When he left, I sat and watched rain move across the parking lot in a gray sheet. I pressed the rosary to my lip. I asked for 3 things only. That my daughter would see truth. That the law would be strong today. Not just in stories. That I would not let anger make me stupid. On the drive home, the fields looked like a quilt under the storm. I slid the truck window down and let the wet air slap me awake. Used up trash, he had said. I tasted metal at the memory. A mother cannot unknow a thing like that. But a mother can choose what to do next. I chose to sharpen the blade. I put fuel in the truck. I balanced last quarter's books so I knew what cushion we had if this dragged on. I scheduled payroll early. If the sky was going to fall, I wanted my people paid. I called my foreman and told him I trusted him, and then I said it again. Because men deserve to hear it twice from a boss like me. I wrote a list for Emily, titled Simple Questions to Ask Before You Sign. I did not send it. I went to bed late and slept little. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of doors that never fully closed, and voices that did not care who heard them. Morning brought coffee, and the kind of steady that acts like armor. I picked up my phone and saw Isaac's message. I think he is in Chicago with a woman. I will get you what you need. I put the phone down and stood in my kitchen while the light grew. I do not like the city, but I like facts. I like lines on a map. Receipts. Names on emails. File dates. Truth with dates is the kind of truth a judge can use. That is what I would bring to Emily. Not a mother's warning. A record. The first photographs came in 2 days later. Time-stamped. Geotagged. The city gleaming in the background, like a promise that never had to keep itself. Ben with a woman whose waist he held like it belonged to him. She had a banker's posture, and the kind of smile people practice in mirrors. Isaac labeled the files with ordinary names. Restaurant. Elevator. Lobby. Ordinary is how wolves walk through crowds. I sat at my desk and opened the images one at a time. Each one took something sharp and trimmed it off me. Not shock. That had burned away in the organ corridor. What I felt now was confirmation settling into place like a brick in a wall. You think you are ready for it. You are not. I saved the pictures. Printed 2 sets. Put one in a metal box with our property deeds. Slid the other into a folder that lived under my sweater drawer. I have learned to keep important things low and close. I met Isaac again to hear the rest. He slid across a small recorder and a sealed envelope. His hands were steady. His eyes were not cruel. Some men who deliver bad news enjoy the power. He did not. You will want to listen to this with your lawyer, he said. The audio was clean. The chain of custody tight. He spoke like a man who had been challenged before and won. Victor cleared his schedule and brought in a young associate named Lena, who knew more about metadata than I ever want to. We listened to Ben in my lawyer's conference room, where the blinds were drawn against the afternoon. He bragged. He mocked. He called my daughter names that make a mother want to bruise. He described how the power of attorney would let him stand in our name when he pleased. He laughed about the ranch like it was inventory. He used that phrase again. Used up trash. Valerie giggled and talked about limits and approvals, like this was a game with points. Lena paused the file and pointed to the waveform. Original capture. No edits. She walked us through the hash value. How it would verify against the device if challenged. She was not much older than Emily. I watched her work and felt a hot rush of gratitude for girls who know their tools. I asked her if she would be our expert at hearing. She nodded like she had been waiting for the question. Ben did not sit still while we gathered. He sent a letter on thick paper. A cease and desist, wrapped in the language of politeness. Do not defame. Do not interfere with business. We reserve our rights. He also had someone call Emily about a document she had missed. A simple thing. No big deal. Just come by. Darling. Emily told me over the phone in a tired voice and asked if I could please be happy for her. Just once. Because marriage is not perfect, and she needed me to try. I could hear Laura in the background. The line clicked. Then cleared. Maybe Laura stepped into the hall. You are an intelligent woman, Laura said when she came on herself. Why are you doing this? What do you gain? I closed my eyes. Laura had eaten at my table many nights. I had set places for her when her own family was late. I asked her the question I had been saving. How much did he pay you? She did not answer. She hung up. People say words cannot hurt you. They are wrong. But signatures will ruin you faster. Victor filed for a temporary restraining order to stop any further use of Emily's signature to encumber the ranch or its equipment. He moved for preservation of evidence. 2. Before anything could be scrubbed. The judge set a hearing. My stomach settled. A hearing means daylight. Daylight prefers truth. I drove Emily to the courthouse myself. She wore a cardigan and kept wiping her hands on it, like the fabric could pull the worry out. In the elevator, she stared at the numbers and did not meet my eyes. I wanted to touch her shoulder. I did not. Mothers can comfort. But sometimes a hand feels like pressure. When the doors opened, Ben was there with a smooth tie and a smoother smile. He put his palm on the small of Emily's back like he owned her and nodded at me like we were equals. In the hallway, his lawyer approached with an incline of the head that said he knew Victor and respected him. He offered a stipulation that sounded kind until you read it twice. Victor read it twice. No. We will see the judge, he said. Inside, the room felt like a classroom, which suited me fine. I like rules, and I like being able to see who is speaking. The judge was careful. He wanted reasons, not feelings. He asked about irreparable harm and balance of equities. Victor spoke about debts secured by my name, about filings we had found notices for but not yet seen recorded. He spoke about trust and the danger of more signatures taken under pressure. Ben's attorney called our fears speculative. He said business sometimes requires quick action and that we were interfering with a young couple's financial life. He used the word meddling. My neck flushed. Then Victor played a small slice of audio, just long enough for the court to see what kind of man they were weighing. The judge held up a hand to stop it. That will do for today, he said. Restraining order granted for 30 days. No new encumbrances. No use of the power of attorney. Preserve all communications. You could feel the air shift. It was not victory. It was breath. Out in the hall, Ben leaned close to Emily and spoke low. I could not hear the words. Only the tone reasonable. Patient. The kind that makes a listener doubt their own eyes. He looked past her at me. There was annoyance there. And something else I had not seen before. Caution. Back at the ranch, cash got tighter. We paid our pickers. We paid our diesel. We delayed one maintenance contract and I did not like the way that felt. I went line by line through expenses and found places to trim that did not cost jobs. I sold a spare pump we kept for comfort. A good boss bleeds her own comforts before she cuts her people. Word got around that we were in a fight. Men I had known 20 years stopped me to say they were with me if it went ugly. Women brought pies I did not have time to eat. I put them in the break room and told the crew who sent them. Morale is a crop you must water. Isaac found the address of Ben's brother. A bar that smelled like old songs and disinfectant. I went alone, because some talks mean more when a woman looks a man in the eye without a witness. Arthur was smaller than Ben, but he took up more space. Grief does that. I put the photographs on the table. I played 30 seconds of the audio. He did not touch the beer for a full minute. When he spoke, his throat sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. "I will tell the court what he did to us," he said. He did not ask for money. He asked for a ride to the notary. We drafted his affidavit that night in Victor's office. I watched each paragraph and made sure the dates were right. Good people get beat because they are loose with dates. Not this time. We had receipts. We had bank statements. We had email printouts with the headers intact. Lena smiled at me when she saw them. "Good," she said. "This will hold." The next morning, Ben's lawyer filed a motion to suppress the audio. Fruit of some poisoned tree, he argued. And I almost laughed because men like him forget that sometimes the tree poisons itself. Lena answered with a case I had never heard of. The judge set argument for the week after. I went back to the ranch and walked rows until the sun climbed. Prayer can be a walk when words are tired. My phone buzzed at noon. A number I did not know. Valerie. Her voice was bright and bored. "I hear you are very committed to your property," she said. She was fishing for fear. I gave her the kind of silence that makes a person wonder if you are recording. Then I said her full name. People who skate on edges hate the sound of their own name spoken by a stranger. She hung up. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with bills and a yellow pad. I wrote 3 columns. Legal, business, heart. Under legal, I listed dates and filings, and what Victor would handle. Under business, I listed shipments, repairs, payroll. Under heart, I wrote one thing: help Emily C. I underlined it once. I went to bed early, which means before midnight, and dreamed of my husband standing by the back fence where we buried the dog. He did not speak. He only nodded at me like men do when they approve. Discovery is a pretty word for a hard process. It means handing over what you have, asking for what they have, and living with the risk that you will learn something worse than you feared. Victor filed our requests like they were nails driven in a straight line. Communications between Ben and Valerie. Drafts of the power of attorney. Any notices of intent to file UCC financing statements naming Chestnut assets. He asked for metadata, for times, for IP addresses. He asked for everything polite rules allow and a few things that would make them show their teeth. They showed their teeth. Ben responded with objections that read like a litany. Ambiguous. Overbroad. Burdensome. Not relevant. He offered a handful of documents printed in a font so faint it felt like an insult. Victor's paralegal scanned, labeled, and filed them anyway. We are not the kind of people who get sloppy just because the other side is rude. In the meantime, we moved to extend the restraining order. The judge would want to know why 30 days was not enough. Victor drafted a simple story. Because the danger remains. Because new facts emerged. Because banks move fast when there is money for the taking. Lena added exhibits. An email thread where Valerie pushed a colleague for a preliminary approval using my family name as if it were collateral already pledged. The subject line made my stomach clench. Chestnut capacity. She treated us like a load rating on a bridge. Emily read the packet at my kitchen table. She had stopped coming by for a while because the house was full of my worry. That morning she stood in the doorway with her hands folded and asked if she could sit. Yes, I said. and brought her coffee the way she likes it. Strong and sweet enough to make a dentist frown. She read silently for 10 minutes. Her eyes went back and forth like a metronome. She touched the page where Valerie's name appeared and left her finger there as if to hold the ink down. "Is this real?" she asked. The quiet I heard in her voice was new. I told her we would not have brought her anything we could not prove in court. She nodded and then shook her head like a person trying to loosen a dream. "I need to talk to him," she said. "Not alone," I answered. She stared at me. I stared back. Mothers and daughters are mirrors and strangers both. When she left, I cried for the first time since the church. Not because of fear. Because hope hurts when it returns after a long walk. At the extension, hearing the courtroom felt more crowded. Gossip works like weather in a small town. You feel it in your bones before you see the storm. Ben sat 2 rows up with his lawyer, who looked like he had slept fine. Valerie did not come. Laura sat behind Emily and kept her palm on my daughter's arm in a way I used to think was kindness. Victor argued, calm and upright. Ben's lawyer argued back and called us dramatic. The judge asked about the audio challenge and set it for the afternoon. He extended the restraining order to the trial date. I did not smile. I do not tempt fortune. Outside. Reporters who have never asked me once about crop yields asked me how it felt. I said I trusted the process and walked on. Laura caught my sleeve and asked to speak to me. She had the posture of someone who needs money soon. I told her we could talk on the record and pointed at the courthouse steps. She let go. Isaac brought us something new that night. Photos of Laura meeting Ben at a motel 2 towns over. Not affectionate, but businesslike. Envelopes on tables. Phones face down. He did not hand them to me like a gift. He put them beside the other proof, like another string in a net. Victor did not say, "I told you so," because he is a good man. He said we would not use them unless we had to, because humiliation is not the same as justice. Ben's motion to suppress the audio landed hard. He said it was illegal recording. Lena explained our state's rules in words even I could carry. Isaac spoke about how he obtained it. About one-party consent and the location and the lack of any expectation of privacy when a man brags in a restaurant booth. The judge listened, without leaning either way. He asked one question that stretched me like a wire. What is the probative value compared to the prejudice? Victor answered exactly right. It shows plan, motive, intent, and state of mind. Prejudice comes from truth, not editing. The judge took it under advisement. I hate that phrase because it means I have to wait. Waiting is work if you do it right. I used the days to shore up what could be shored. I met with the bank we have used for 15 years and told the branch manager what we were up against. I did not ask for special treatment or expect sympathy. I asked for clear terms. He gave me a list and I gave him my numbers. We set a line of credit I hoped I would not use. I told my crew leads the plan for the next month. I looked every man in the eye and told him if we needed to cut hours, I would take mine first. They nodded, and one of them said what men say when they feel seen. "We got you, boss." At night I walked the rows and talked to my husband under my breath. I told him what Victor had filed and the case law I pretended I understood. I told him I was scared, and also proud of Emily for reading the emails without looking away. I told him I had learned something late. Pride kept me from telling Emily before the wedding that I did not like the way Ben's eyes passed over my tool shed like it was inventory. Mothers do that. We pretend a man will grow into the space we wish for him. He did not. Men grow into the shape they are rewarded for. On the 5th day, the judge ruled. Audio admitted. A narrow win. He called it. And warned us not to overuse the word trash. It inflames. I smiled at that in spite of myself. There are worse things than a judge who worries about words. We set the trial date. Ben's lawyer asked for a continuance. Denied. I smiled again. Small. The calendar felt like a spine straightening. Emily came over that night with a cardboard box of little things from her house. A framed photo of her father holding her at 5. Muddy boots by the back door. A coffee mug that says best mornings are made. A sweater she wore on the day Ben proposed. She put the box on my table and sat down. I am not brave, she said. I told her, bravery is not a feeling. It is a choice you make while your stomach turns. She nodded. I told her the truth I had been saving for when she could hear it. You are not used up. You are not trash. You are my daughter and a force. She cried then. Quietly. And I let her because tears are a kind of washing. The next morning, we prepped Arthur for his testimony. He had ironed his shirt and combed his hair and looked like a man who might sleep again one day. Victor walked him through questions. I watched his hands while he spoke. They were steady when he told how Ben had taken the last of his parents' savings. They shook when he described his father's stroke. He asked if it mattered that he had been a fool. Victor said the law cares about acts, not shame. I watched Arthur stand up a little taller at that. There was one more thing, and it seemed small until it wasn't. A notice arrived that afternoon. An unsigned draft UCC financing statement. The kind that gets mailed by mistake when someone prepares to file in haste. It named equipment that sits in my barn. It named the ranch. It named a debtor that was not me. I stared at it until the words blurred and then came back into focus darker than before. Preparation is a kind of confession. I put the paper down. Took a breath that felt like the first breath after pushing a truck out of mud. And called Victor. It is time. I said. File the suit. He said he already had. The morning of the filing felt colder than the forecast. I woke before the alarm. Sat on the edge of my bed. And stared at the wall until dawn slipped under the curtains. I could hear the wind through the mango trees and the distant hum of a tractor. Reminders that life on the ranch kept moving, no matter what storm I was walking into. Victor had filed the civil complaint at 9 sharp Chestnut V's. Ramirez et al. It sounded clean and professional on paper. But what it really meant was war. Fraud. Embezzlement. Breach of fiduciary duty. Conspiracy to defraud, all of it, now stamped in black ink. I drove into town to meet him. He looked tired but steady. That calm you only earn after 30 years of fighting for people who still believe in fairness. Ben will hit back hard, Victor warned, sliding the papers across the desk. He'll say, you're bitter. That this is personal. He'll drag up anything he can find to make you look unhinged. You ready for that? I wasn't sure anyone could ever be ready to be torn apart in public. But I nodded anyway. He's already taken enough. I won't let him take silence. 2. Ben's counterattack came faster than expected. By noon, his lawyer had filed a motion accusing me of defamation and intentional interference with a business contract. They asked for damages in the hundreds of thousands. A press release followed baseless claims by disgruntled relative. He wanted the narrative back. For a day or two? He got it. Local radio picked it up. Some of the same people who had apologized to me months ago went quiet again when they saw me at the market. That night, Isaac texted, he's moving money. We met in his car near the edge of town. He showed me bank screenshots. Wire transfers from Ben's shell company to accounts in Chicago and Mexico. He's trying to hide the trail, Isaac said. But he's sloppy. The timestamps match the filing date. It looks like panic. I watched the glow of the screen light his face and thought of how greed always runs faster than reason. Can we freeze it? I asked. Not yet. But we can track it. We drove in silence for a bit. The road ahead shimmered with heat, though the night was cold. You ever wonder, Isaac said, why people like him think they'll never get caught, because they never believe women like me can count? I answered. When I got home, the ranch was asleep. The dogs lifted their heads and went back to dreaming. I stood outside the porch and looked toward the storage barn. The place my father used to call the heart of the land. The air smelled of wet soil. Every nail. Every fence post. Every square of this ground carried someone's effort. I couldn't let it end as a footnote in Ben's spreadsheet. At dawn, Victor called. The judge granted the discovery order for the bank emails. We'll subpoena the Chicago branch tomorrow. And if you win, Audrey, his voice softened. You did good. For the first time in weeks, I sat down and let myself breathe. But victory never comes alone. By evening, a dark sedan appeared near the ranch gate. A man stepped out, placed an envelope under the mailbox, and drove off. Inside was a single photograph, Emily walking out of a grocery store. Unaware of the camera, on the back, one word was written in neat male handwriting. Stop. I felt my throat close. This wasn't just business anymore. It was intimidation. I called Isaac. He came within the hour, took the photo, and scanned the road with a flashlight. He's rattled, Isaac said quietly. That's good. Means we're closing in. I wasn't sure I agreed. Fear has a smell, and I could sense it thick in the air. But fear also sharpens the will. I locked the gates that night and sat in the kitchen with the rosary wound tight around my hand. Ben thought the threat would scare me into silence. He didn't know the kind of woman he was dealing with. By the next morning, I was in Victor's office again, watching as he drafted a motion for protective order, not just for evidence, but for my daughter. If he wants to play rough, Victor said, we'll let the law do the hitting. I nodded. I had stopped shaking. Somewhere between the insult I overheard in that church hallway and the photograph under my mailbox, something inside me had hardened into resolve. Let him come. I was done being afraid. Courtrooms smell like paper, coffee, and fear. The hearing that morning was supposed to be procedural, just another step before trial. But everyone felt the tension. Ben arrived in a navy suit too sharp for a man with his conscience. Valerie wasn't there, but her name was on everyone's lips after the subpoena to her bank hit the Chicago press. Victor stood beside me, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. Across the aisle, Ben's attorney, a smooth-talking man named Grayson, leaned toward the judge with that polite arrogance only expensive lawyers wear. Your Honor, he began. These subpoenas are nothing more than a fishing expedition. My client's business relationships have no relevance to the alleged emotional grievances of his mother-in-law. Victor's voice cut through like gravel. This isn't emotion, Your Honor. It's evidence of a financial scheme. We're tracing Chestnut Ranch collateral through shell entities to accounts managed by Miss Guzman. The judge adjusted his glasses. Miss Guzman being an employee of the same bank that approved Mr. Usical Ramirez's loans using the Chestnut estate as implied collateral. You could feel the air shift. Ben's jaw tightened. The judge granted the subpoenas. Grayson objected for the record, but his voice lacked conviction. After the hearing, reporters swarmed the steps. Victor shielded me with his arm and whispered, no comments. But the questions still came flying. Is it true your daughter signed over the ranch? Do you believe your son-in-law will face criminal charges? I kept walking. Let the paper chase the story. I was chasing justice. That evening, I met Emily at the diner just outside town. She looked smaller than I remembered, not thinner, just worn. Her eyes darted toward the window every time a car passed. I reached across the table, palm open. He's scared. I told her. That means we're winning. Mom, she said softly. I don't want to win. I just want it to stop. The words sank into me like stones. I understood too well. Revenge doesn't taste sweet until the end. Most of the time it's ash and sleepless nights. But justice is different. Justice builds something after the fire. You'll have your peace, I said. But not before we make sure he can't hurt anyone else. She nodded, tears catching in the neon light. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. You don't owe me an apology, I said, though I felt my chest crack open a little. You owe yourself a better life. That's all. Later that week, Isaac brought the data from Chicago transaction logs, hotel receipts, and a string of encrypted emails between Ben and Valerie. One line stood out: once she signs the second POA, we're in the clear. After that, we can liquidate before she notices. Victor printed the thread, highlighting every phrase that dripped with arrogance. This, he said, tapping the page, is intent. But even with evidence, nothing comes easy. 2 nights later, my truck's tires were slashed outside the ranch. No footprints. Just the hiss of ruined rubber and the distant laughter of coyotes. Isaac insisted on posting a camera by the gate. We'll give him rope, he said. He'll hang himself with it. The next morning, Emily called in a panic. Mom, Ben showed up at my work. He said, you're ruining everything. He said, if I don't make you stop, her voice cracked. I told her to stay where she was and called Victor. Within an hour, he filed for an emergency restraining order. The judge signed it electronically before lunch. I drove to Emily's office, waited with her until police served Ben the papers. He glared at me as they handed him the envelope. Still think you can win, he said, his voice low, venomous. I already have, I told him. He laughed a short, empty sound and walked away. That night, I sat on the porch, the sky thick with stars, the air heavy with dust and summer promise. I thought about how strange justice is, how it moves like water through cracks. Slow but unstoppable. Inside, my phone buzzed. A message from Victor Bank Compliance has confirmed the transfers. Valerie's testimony will be compelled next week. Prepare yourself. Things will break open soon. I turned off the light and watched the fields shimmer under the moon. The mango trees swayed like they were breathing. Somewhere out there, in the dark, I imagined my husband's voice, keep her safe. Keep the land whole, I whispered back. Almost done. Love. Almost. I used to believe storms had edges. You could watch one roll in from the west. You could count the seconds between lightning and thunder. You could say when it would pass. This storm had no edges. It was everywhere at once. It was in the courthouse and in my kitchen and in the way Emily gripped her keys when she walked to her car. The morning after the emergency order, Grayson filed 3 things before I finished my first cup of coffee. A motion to dissolve the restraining order, a motion to seal the bank subpoenas, and a glossy packet that claimed I had interfered with Ben's commercial contracts by spreading falsehoods. He wanted sanctions. He wanted money. He wanted me scared enough to back away from the fence. Victor called at 8 and told me to meet him at the office. He had 2 ties rolled on his desk and a yellow pad covered in his small block letters. He read me the parts that mattered and saved the theatrics for court. He is a good lawyer because he never confuses volume with strength. We argued the motions that afternoon. The judge kept a tight room. Ben sat at counsel table and pretended to be above the fray. But the muscles along his jaw ticked like a clock you could not quite hear. Grayson said the order was an overreach and that my fear was speculative. Victor said fear had nothing to do with it. He spoke about the photograph left at my gate, about the slashed tires, about a young woman whose husband had appeared at her work to tell her that everything would burn if she did not obey. The judge extended the order for 60 days and set a hearing on the bank subpoenas for the following week. When his gavel came down, you could feel the room breathe. After the hearing, I walked Emily to the parking garage while Isaac shadowed us from a distance. She looked at me without flinching. That was new. Do you think this ever ends? She asked. Yes, I said. There is a line on a calendar with a circle on it. You and I will stand there, and we will still be standing after he is gone. That night I sat on the porch steps and watched the camera feed from the gate on my phone. The dog slept at my feet, heavy and warm. Around midnight, a pickup rolled past slow. Then again, half an hour later, the plate showed up clear. Isaac ran it by morning and called me with a name that did not surprise me. Alio. He was never far from the money, and he had a way of arriving just before something went missing. Victor filed a motion for a protective order that covered not only evidence but physical safety. He added a request for expedited depositions of Valerie and Elio, worried that delay would become erasure. Grayson opposed with words that sounded reasonable if you did not know what a reasonable man sounds like. The judge split the difference. Valerie would be deposed within 10 days. Elio would follow. Ben would sit last. In between court dates, life insisted on being lived. I signed paychecks. I approved a rush shipment when a distributor in Canada doubled their order. I met with my foreman by the loading dock as the sun burned off the mist and asked about the new crew of boys from 2 towns over. They are strong and polite, he said, and then added that they also asked questions about me that had nothing to do with packing fruit. I told him to keep them on a short leash and to send the gossipers home if their mouths worked faster than their hands. He nodded. We were not a courtroom, but we had rules. Isaac and I drove to Chicago 2 days later. He hates company on a pull. But this was not a pull. This was a meeting with a compliance officer who had decided that obeying a subpoena was better than losing a career. We sat in a gray room with gray carpet, and a woman in a navy suit set a stack of printouts on the table like she was placing a newborn by a bedside. None of it was warm, but all of it was alive. Email headers, approval logs, access records with Valerie's initials. More than once, my name sat in a subject line next to the word capacity, and I had to stand up and walk to the window so I would not say something I could not take back. The woman cleared her throat when I returned to my chair. I am not here to make statements, she said. I am here because the court told me to hand this over. Victor thanked her as if she had done more than obey the law. That is his way. Make space for decency, and sometimes it steps forward. On the drive home, Isaac watched the mirrors while I watched the road. He asked what I would do if the judge sealed the emails at Grayson's request. I said we would try the case with what we had. And what we had could stand on its own legs. He smiled. You are a rancher, he said. You always talk about legs. I told him legs matter, whether you are looking at horses or facts. When we reached the county line, my phone lit with a message from Lena. She had cracked a small piece of Valerie's pattern. The same device that accessed Ben's financial files at the bank had also accessed a personal cloud where receipts from luxury shops were stored. Cross-reference with hotel dates, she wrote. It sings. I sent her a thumbs up and then texted her a thank you spelled out. Because you should never get lazy with gratitude. The deposition of Valerie took place in a sterile conference room with a view of a parking deck. She arrived late. Eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Her lawyer sat beside her and objected to half the questions before Valerie even answered. Victor was patient. He showed her one receipt, then another. He walked her through email after email until her voice lost its brightness. Finally, he slid the photo of her with Ben, leaving a restaurant, and asked a question so simple it could not be dodged. That is you. Correct. She stared at it for a long time. Yes, she said. And you were with Mr. Ramirez? Yes. Did you discuss loans that referenced Chestnut assets? Her lawyer objected. She answered anyway. Yes. After? In the hall. She stood by the window and looked at her reflection in the glass. She did not look like a villain. She looked like a person who had let herself move the wrong direction, 1 inch at a time, until there was no map back. I did not speak to her. I did not trust what would come out of my mouth. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and watched the numbers climb and then fall. Grayson filed another motion that afternoon. He wanted to keep Valerie off the witness list. The judge denied it in 3 lines. Sometimes mercy looks like a paragraph. Sometimes justice looks like a sentence. That evening, as the sun went down behind the eastern ridge, I found Emily on the back steps of the house, with her knees pulled to her chest. She had a box at her feet, filled with things that no longer belonged in her life. A jewelry piece Ben had given her that never fit right. A small, framed menu from their first date. A set of keys to a door she would never open again. She pushed the box toward me with her sneaker. "Can you take this to the dump?" she asked. "I can," I said. "Or we can burn it." She thought for a moment, and then shook her head. "Fire would make it important again," she said. "Let it go quiet." We drove to the county landfill the next morning and tipped the box into a bin that clanged. On the way home, she rolled down the window and let the air take her hair. She closed her eyes and smiled a little. Not a big smile. The kind you get when a tight place inside starts to loosen. Back at the ranch, the gate camera caught Alio's pickup rolling past again. This time he did not stop. This time he took the road out of town and did not come back. Isaac sent me a message 3 hours later. "He is in another state." "Good," I wrote. "Let him run." The hearing on the bank subpoenas arrived fast. Grayson argued, sealing like a man who knew he was shoveling sand against the tide. Victor argued openness like a farmer talks about daylight. The judge kept the emails in the record. He allowed limited redactions. He set a clear line that none of us would cross. I walked out of the courtroom and felt the sun on my face and thought about the first time I taught Emily to prune a young tree. "You do not cut to punish," I told her then. "You cut to help it grow straight." I had never expected to be saying the same thing to a judge in a roundabout way. That night, I slept for 5 hours in a row. It felt like a luxury I no longer deserved, and also like a right I had reclaimed. When I woke before dawn, the house was quiet. I made coffee and drank it on the porch while the sky turned from bruise to pearl. The phone buzzed at 6. "Isaac again. We have a problem," he said. "Someone came by Arthur's place in the night. He is fine. But his front window is not." I was out the door and in the truck before the second sentence landed. The storm had moved again. I drove toward it with the steadiness you get when you have already decided you will not yield. Arthur lived in a small rented house at the edge of town where the grass grows uneven and the mail comes late. When I pulled up, a sheet of plywood covered his front window. Isaac stood on the porch with a notebook and a face that said he was angry in a quiet way. Arthur opened the door and waved me in with a hand that had not fully stopped shaking. I brought cinnamon rolls from the diner. I do not bake when I am worried. I buy. The kitchen smelled like cheap coffee and wood glue. Arthur sat, then stood, then sat again. He looked like a man who had stayed up through the bad hours and was now paying for it with the jitter of his nerves. I set the box on the table and pushed it toward him. He cleared his throat. "They did not knock," he said. I heard the glass and then the truck. Isaac showed me the camera still. It was not the pickup this time. It was a sedan with plates that belonged to no one. Cowards like the dark. They also like cars that return to rental lots before sunrise. I asked Arthur if he wanted to move to a motel until the depositions were over. He shook his head. He had the stubborn pride of a man who has lost too much to give away even one more inch. I told him stubborn pride could get a man hurt and that there was nothing weak about sleeping somewhere with a lobby and a night clerk. He looked at me for a long time. "Fine," he said. "2 nights. I will not hide longer than that." Isaac smiled at me behind his hand. I did not smile back because I did not want Arthur to think this was a game. We drove to the motel and paid cash. Isaac left to pick up plywood and screws. I stayed with Arthur and went over his affidavit again. We checked dates and addresses, and he told me about the day his father went down. How the bacon burned in the pan, and his mother stood very still, as if stillness could hold a heart together. He spoke slowly. People speak slowly when they are balancing grief and precision. When Isaac returned, he had more than plywood. He had a small safe. "Put your documents in here," he said. And then he told Arthur to choose a code he would remember, even if he was tired or crying. Arthur chose a birthday. Isaac told him never to tell anyone which birthday. I watched them and felt something like appreciation for 2 men who barely knew each other but understood the rules of this kind of fight. That afternoon, we met Victor at his office to prep Arthur for a recorded statement. He wore the same clean shirt from before and had shaved badly. which made him look younger and somehow more serious. Victor walked him through the arc of testimony. He explained what belonged in answers and what did not. He told him it was fair to say, "I do not know," if he did not know. And fair to say, "I do not remember," if memory would not come. He told him not to guess. Arthur nodded. When a man has been tricked by someone he loves, he does not want to be caught guessing again. We took a break. I stepped into the hall and looked at the framed certificates that lined the wall. My father's name was not on any of them. But his work was everywhere, in the way I stood straighter, and in the way I understood the comfort of rules. He had taught me to measure twice and cut once. That is what we were doing here. We were measuring. When the recorder clicked on, Arthur spoke like a man who had carried a story for too long and had finally been handed a place to set it down. He described how Ben wooed investors with big words and staged photos. He described the night Ben came to him with an opportunity that sounded like rescue and turned out to be ruin. He described the day the bank called his mother by her first name and asked her to remit what she did not have. He did not cry. Neither did I. I kept my eyes on the table and counted 4 breaths for every 3 heartbeats until the part where he said that he had called his brother and asked him to come home, and Ben had hung up. Then I had to look away and find the window. After we finished, Victor printed the transcript and handed Arthur a pen. He signed slowly, as if each letter came at a price. When he was done, he pressed the tip of the pen to the period and held it there until the dot bled a little. "Enough," he said. "Enough." On the walk to the parking lot, Ben appeared. He leaned against a pillar with his hands in his pockets like a boy cut from a slick catalog. For a second, the years fell away, and I saw the young man who had charmed my daughter. The one who used kindness like a lure. Then he smiled, and the old cold slid into place. "You brought him," he said to me, in a voice that should have been tender and was not. "Family should not do this to family." Arthur stepped forward. "Family should not steal from family," he said. Ben's eyes flicked to the bruise along the edge of the plywood cut on Arthur's hand. He smiled wider. "You always did love drama," he said. "Walk away," Arthur answered. "Now." Ben waited a beat too long, then did as he was told. Victor called building security. They wrote a report that would matter later, even if it did not matter now. Isaac took Arthur back to the motel and posted himself in a chair in the hall, outside the door, with a paperback and a thermos like a man who had done this before. I drove home slower than usual. You cannot carry anger and speed at the same time without one of them spilling. At the ranch, Emily was in the office with the accounts open. She looked up and asked how Arthur was. I told her the truth. He was shaking, then steady, then shaking again. She nodded. "That sounds right," she said. She tapped the ledger and showed me a line she had tightened. A supplier discount she had won with an early payment promise. A small change that would save us real money over a year. Pride moved through me like warmth after a cold swim. "Your grandfather would have liked that," I said. She smiled without looking away from the screen. Near dusk, a patrol car rolled slowly past the gate. The deputy lifted 2 fingers in a salute, and I returned it. The town was watching. Some watched for gossip. Some watched for good. You learn the difference by who shows up when you have to lift something heavy. Valerie's deposition transcript arrived by email after supper. I printed it and read it at the kitchen table. It was worse than I wanted and better than I feared. She had admitted enough to matter and denied enough to show the shape of the truth she wanted to hide. There was a line where she described Ben's plan in a way that made my hand go numb. Once she signs the second power of attorney, we are in the clear. After that, we liquidate. She had said it like she was reading off a grocery list. I stood up and walked to the sink and turned on the cold water and let it run over my wrists until the shock brought me back into my body. The next morning, we deposed Elio. He swaggered for the first 5 minutes and then shrank when Isaac laid a photograph on the table of his pickup idling by my gate. He said he was lost, and we let the lie sit there between us like a dead thing. Victor asked about the shell companies. Alio said he did not know what that meant. Victor showed him the incorporation papers with his signature. Alio frowned like a student who had not studied. He asked for a break and never got his shape back after that. As we packed up, Arthur walked into the conference room, even though he was not scheduled to speak that day. He did not look at Alio. He looked at me. "I am ready for court," he said. I believed him. He had the look of a man who had put down a load and discovered that he could still climb a hill. On the way out, Emily called. Her voice was calm. "I went by the church," she said. "I sat in the side corridor where you heard them laughing. I wanted to see if the place still felt holy." "Does it?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Holiness does not leave, because men say ugly things in its doorway." I sat with that for a while. Parked in my truck, with the engine off and the windows down. The afternoon breeze moving through like something blessed. The trial date was 1 week away when the judge issued a short order that changed our posture completely. The audio would come in. The emails would come in with modest redactions. Valerie would testify under subpoena. The protective order would stay in force through the end of trial. I called Victor to thank him, and he said what he always says when work has been done well. "Save your thanks for the verdict." That night I wrote a letter to my husband in the back of my ledger, the place where I keep numbers and occasionally prayers. I told him his girl had become the kind of woman who can run a ranch and a legal fight at the same time. I told him I had learned to pray with my hands on the wheel and my eyes open. I told him he could rest. I slept with the window open and woke to the sound of the crew laughing at something small and good. The light came in clean. I stood at the sink and watched the field and felt the quiet bravery that sometimes visits when you have done everything you can do, and it is almost time to hand the rest to the room with the flag and the seal and the judge who asks for reasons, not feelings. I finished my coffee and went to work. There was still fruit to move and lists to cross and witnesses to call. There was a circle on a calendar coming closer. Trial was a week away. But time had begun to lose shape. Each sunrise felt both urgent and slow, like the long breath before a storm breaks. Victor called it the quiet before discovery turns into testimony. For me, it was the quiet before judgment of the court, of the town, of my own daughter's heart. I woke each morning before dawn and checked the irrigation pumps myself. The men offered to handle it. But I needed the rhythm, the hiss of water through the lines, the smell of wet soil. Those were sounds that made sense. Patterns I could trust when everything else was turning into paper and whispers. Emily worked beside me now. Shoulders strong. Hair tied back. There was a steadiness in her I hadn't seen since she was a girl. She reviewed shipping invoices while I logged the week's yields. We didn't talk much about the trial. Sometimes, silence is the only language people who love each other can bear. Victor arrived 3 days before court with a box full of labeled binders. "Everything the judge will see," he said. "Chronological. Color-coded." He laid them out on the kitchen table, blue for financials, green for witness affidavits, red for exhibits. My table looked like a war map. "What happens first?" I asked. "Jury selection. Opening statements. Then they'll try to make you look like a vindictive old woman." I smiled without humor. "They've been trying that for a year. It hasn't worked yet." He looked at me carefully. "Just remember, calm wins more than fury." That night, Isaac stopped by with coffee and a flash drive. "Security footage from the motel," he said. Arthur's window was smashed by a hired kid. About 20. Car registered to a rental under Alio's shell company. We turned it over to the police. I watched the footage in silence. A boy with a hoodie. A blur of motion. Glass scattering like rain. The kind of violence that doesn't think ahead. "You ever wonder?" I asked. "If Ben even understands what he's losing?" Isaac shrugged. "Men like him don't understand loss until the lock clicks behind them." 2 nights later, Emily knocked on my bedroom door. She held a letter in her hands, crumpled at the edges. He sent this, she said. It was from Ben, a handwritten note that smelled faintly of his cologne. I'm sorry for everything, it said. Tell your mother to drop this madness. We can fix it. We can rebuild. Emily's eyes glistened. Do you think he means it? I took the letter, tore it in half, and handed it back. A man who wants redemption doesn't mail it. He earns it. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. But she didn't try to stop me when I tossed the scraps into the fireplace. The next morning we drove to Victor's office for the final prep. He rehearsed my testimony, asking the hard questions first. Did you record that conversation yourself? Why didn't you tell your daughter earlier? Did you have any personal hatred toward your son-in-law before the discovery of the fraud? I answered as plainly as I could. I did not record it. My investigator did. Legally. I didn't tell her because I needed proof. And I didn't hate him. I just saw what he was. Victor smiled faintly. Perfect. Honest. That's what they'll remember. When we finished, I drove Emily home in silence. The mango trees shimmered under the late summer sun. Somewhere behind us, thunder rolled across the plains. Tomorrow, Emily whispered. Yes, I said. Tomorrow, everything starts to come clean. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the porch. The air thick with humidity and cicadas. I thought about my husband, about my father, about the generations that had built this land. I thought about the weight of a last name that meant something once, and about how close we had come to losing it all to a man's greed and a daughter's trust. Then I thought about Emily, asleep inside, and I realized the fight was no longer about vengeance. It was about legacy, not the land, not the money, but the kind of courage we pass down without meaning to. I clutched my rosary and whispered the same prayer I had whispered since that first night in the church hallway. Protect her. Guide me. Let the truth stand. When dawn came, it came like judgment, bright, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Courthouses always smell faintly of disinfectant and nerves. The air feels thick with other people's secrets. That morning, I walked through the metal detector with my chin up and my hands steady. I had brought no purse, no jewelry, no distraction, just a single handkerchief and my rosary tucked inside my coat pocket. Emily walked beside me. Her dress was simple, gray, professional. I noticed how her posture had changed, no longer the nervous bride from St. Francis, but a woman bracing for her own testimony. Victor met us in the hallway. Remember, he said quietly, we're not here to humiliate him. We're here to prove he did what he did. I nodded. Justice, not spectacle. The courtroom filled quickly, neighbors, ranchers, even reporters from Chicago. The whispering sounded like the wind before a storm. I caught sight of Laura in the back row, her face pale, lips pressed tight. She had returned to town for this. Ben entered wearing a navy suit, the same color he had worn the day of the restraining order. His confidence had faded, but arrogance still clung to him like cologne. Valerie wasn't there. She was under subpoena for the second day. Grayson, his attorney, offered a thin smile as if this were just another business meeting. The judge entered, gavel in hand, and everyone rose. The sound of wood striking wood was the cleanest sound I'd ever heard. Victor's opening statement was measured, almost gentle. He spoke of family trust, of deception dressed as love, of the danger of blind signatures and false promises. He didn't raise his voice once, but each word felt like it had been carved from stone. Grayson's turn came next. He painted me as a controlling matriarch who couldn't stand to see her daughter independent. This case, he said, pacing like a salesman, is about resentment, not fraud, about a mother who can't let go. I felt Emily flinch beside me. Victor put a hand on her arm. Let him talk, he whispered. The truth doesn't need volume. Then came the evidence. The photos Isaac had taken appeared on the screen. Ben and Valerie, laughing over wine in Chicago, their hands intertwined. The timestamp glowed in red at the bottom corner. The jury watched quietly, no gasps, no whispers. Just that still silence that means belief is taking root. Next, Victor played the audio. Ben's voice filled the courtroom. Sharp and careless. Once she signs, the ranch is ours. Her mother thinks she's clever, but she'll be signing her own foreclosure papers soon enough. The sound echoed like thunder under the courthouse ceiling. Emily covered her mouth. Laura bowed her head. Ben's attorney objected to the prejudicial nature of the tape, but the judge overruled him. Proceed, he said. When the audio ended, Victor looked at the jury and simply said, "This is not love. This is theft." Grayson tried to recover with cross-examination. He suggested the tape was manipulated. Lena, cool and precise, took the stand to explain the chain of custody, the hash verification, the timestamps, any alteration, she said calmly, would change the hash signature. It did not. Then came my turn. I walked to the witness stand with my rosary in my pocket and the whole town's eyes on me. I swore to tell the truth. My voice didn't tremble. Victor began. "Mrs. Chestnut, tell the court what you heard on your daughter's wedding day." I told them everything, the laughter behind the door, the words that split me in half, the decision to stay silent until I could protect her properly. My voice stayed steady even when my throat wanted to close. When Grayson took over, his tone shifted from polite to sharp. "Mrs. Chestnut, you claim to have heard my client say these words, 'used up trash.' Are you certain? Isn't it possible you misheard?" "I know what I heard," I said. "I've known the sound of cruelty since childhood. It doesn't whisper. It cuts." He frowned, flipped through his notes, and tried again. "Do you consider yourself a forgiving woman?" "I do," I answered. "But forgiveness and protection are not the same thing. You forgive after justice, not instead of it." Even the judge's pen paused for a moment. When my testimony ended, Victor nodded once, that small nod that says, "You did what you came to do." As we left the stand, I passed by Emily. She caught my hand, squeezed it hard, and whispered, "I believe you now." Mom, that was the only verdict I needed that day. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sky above the courthouse turned the color of old tin. Tomorrow, Valerie would testify. The second act of this storm was waiting. The courthouse smelled like rain that morning. Thunder pressed against the sky, the kind of gray that makes every color look sharper. When I stepped out of the car, Victor was already waiting by the entrance, a folder tucked beneath his arm. "She showed up," he said quietly. "Valerie's here." I looked toward the main doors. Valerie Guzman was standing beside her attorney, her usual gloss stripped away. She looked smaller than she had in those photographs, pale, fragile, and human. The heels, the expensive perfume, the arrogance all gone. She clutched a tissue as though it were armor. Inside, the crowd had doubled since yesterday. The reporters were back, cameras ready. The air buzzed with curiosity. Emily sat behind Victor, her posture straight, but her knuckles white around a pen. I reached for her hand. She didn't look at me, but she squeezed back. When the clerk called Valerie's name, the room fell silent. She walked slowly to the witness stand, swore her oath, and sat. The judge's voice was steady. "Proceed." "Counselor," Victor started gently. "Miss Guzman, you worked for the Chicago branch of Madison Bank, correct?" "Yes." "And part of your role included facilitating corporate loans for private clients?" "Yes." He handed her a document. "Do you recognize this loan agreement?" Her eyes flickered to Ben, who sat 2 tables away. "Yes," she whispered. "Who initiated it?" She hesitated. Ben Ramirez. And was the Chestnut Ranch listed as collateral? Another pause. Yes. The whisper that rippled through the room sounded like the first crack of lightning. Victor kept his voice even. Did you have a personal relationship with Mr. Ramirez? Grayson jumped to his feet. Objection, relevance, the judge didn't even look up. Overruled. You may answer. Valerie's hands twisted in her lap. Yes, she said. We were involved. And during that relationship, did he ever discuss using his wife's signature or her family's assets for personal gain? She stared down at her hands. He said it was just business. He said she'd never know. Victor let the silence hang. Then he played the recording again, the one where Ben bragged about the little pig and the fortune soon in our hands. Valerie closed her eyes when her own laughter came through the speakers. When it ended, she was crying. I thought he loved me, she said. Voice breaking. I thought we were going to start a new life. He said he'd leave his wife once the ranch was secure. Victor nodded slightly. Did you participate in falsifying documents? Yes. I did what he asked. But I didn't know. I didn't think. Her words collapsed under the weight of what she'd done. Grayson stood. Smooth and rehearsed. Miss Guzman, you were never forced to assist my client. Were you? No? You received money. Gifts. Travel. You benefited from this relationship, yes. So you are complicit. Her lawyer tried to object. But the damage was done. Valerie dropped her gaze. Shame visible in every line of her face. When Victor returned for redirect, his voice softened. Why are you telling the truth now? She looked straight at Emily for the first time. Because she didn't deserve any of it. None of it. The courtroom was silent again. Even Ben had stopped pretending to be calm. He leaned forward, whispering furiously to his lawyer. When the judge excused Valerie, she rose and walked past the defense table. Ben reached for her wrist, but she pulled away, eyes blazing. You used me, she hissed, just like you used her. Her footsteps echoed all the way down the hall. The judge called for a short recess. Emily didn't move. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was steady. He'll never touch this family again, she whispered. No, I said. He won't. When the recess ended, the defense tried to pivot to paint Ben as a visionary businessman undone by paperwork and betrayal. But the jury's eyes told the truth. They had heard enough. The mask had cracked. By the time the gavel fell to adjourn for the day, the rain outside had broken loose, pounding against the courthouse steps like applause from heaven itself. The storm had moved east overnight, leaving the air washed clean. The sky above the courthouse was a hard, bright blue, the kind that feels like judgment. Arthur arrived early, a plain white shirt under a worn jacket, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. You ready? Victor asked. Arthur nodded. Been ready for years. Inside, the tension felt different, sharper, quieter. Everyone knew what was coming. The bailiff called his name, and he walked to the stand without looking at Ben. He took the oath. Voice steady. Victor began, his tone respectful. Mr. Arthur Ramirez, please state your relation to the defendant. He's my brother, Arthur said, older by 3 years. Were you ever in business together? Yes. We started a construction supply company in Illinois. He handled the contracts, I handled the books. And what happened? Arthur's eyes hardened. He drained our accounts, moved the money through fake vendors. I found out when the IRS came knocking. My father had to mortgage his house to cover the debt. Ben shifted in his seat, eyes down. Did you confront him? I did. He laughed. Said business is business. Said family should understand. Victor let the words hang heavy before asking. When you learned about Mrs. Chestnut's case, why did you agree to testify? Arthur's jaw tightened. Because I wanted the truth to count for something. He ruined one family already. I won't let him ruin another. Victor placed a document in front of him. Is this your sworn statement? Arthur glanced down. Yes. And does it accurately describe the pattern of fraud used by your brother in both businesses? Yes. No further questions. Grayson rose slowly. Mr. Ramirez, you admit you and your brother were once partners. Isn't it true that after your business failed, you blamed him for your own mistakes? Arthur didn't flinch. The mistake was trusting him. You hate him. Don't you? Arthur's eyes met his brother's. Hate doesn't cover it. But hate isn't why I'm here. Then why? To stop him. Someone should have done it sooner. The courtroom fell so still, you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Grayson hesitated, sensing the air turning. No further questions. He muttered, and sat down. Ben broke then. He leaned across the table, shouting, You think you're a saint. Arthur, you're just jealous, you always have been. The judge slammed the gavel. Mr. Ramirez, control yourself. But it was too late. The image was burned into every juror's mind, the arrogance, the temper, the truth of who he really was. When the noise settled, Victor stood. Your Honor. The plaintiff rests. The judge nodded. The defense may begin tomorrow. Outside. Sunlight flooded the steps. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. But I walked straight through them. Emily caught up beside me, tears in her eyes. He can't lie his way out anymore, she said. No, I said softly. The truth finally speaks louder. That night, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the crickets. The stars seemed closer than usual, the kind of quiet sky my husband used to love. I closed my eyes and whispered, We're almost there. In the distance. Thunder grumbled again, not from the sky this time, but from the slow approach of justice. Tomorrow, the defense would try to save what little was left. But deep down, I already knew the verdict had begun forming in the hearts of 12 ordinary people who had seen what greed and cruelty look like under light. And light never lies. The final morning of the trial arrived clear and cold. The courthouse loomed against a pale blue sky, its old stone walls glinting with the first light of day. Everything smelled faintly of polish and nerves. I sat in the front row beside Victor, my hands folded over my rosary. Emily was just behind me, her face pale but calm. Across the aisle, Ben stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if trying to hold his world together by sheer will. His suit looked wrinkled now, his eyes shadowed. The man who had walked into our lives all charm and confidence was gone. What remained was something brittle, a shell waiting to crack. Grayson began the defense's closing argument. His voice was smooth, almost pleading. Ladies and gentlemen, my client made mistakes, but he is not a monster. He's a man who overreached, who trusted the wrong people. Should a single error destroy his life, he spoke of redemption, of misunderstanding, of emotions clouding business. But the jurors' faces stayed blank, unmoved. They had seen too much. Then Victor rose. His voice was quiet, but every word landed like truth, carving its initials into stone. This case is not about mistakes. It's about deception, deliberate, calculated cruelty. Mr. Ramirez didn't stumble into wrongdoing, he planned it. He built his lies on love, turned trust into leverage, and mocked the people who gave him everything. He held up one document, the power of attorney Emily had signed. This paper represents every mother and daughter who ever believed a lie because they wanted to see the good in someone. Today, you have a chance to tell the world that trust is sacred, that manipulation has a price. When Victor finished, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fans. The judge thanked the attorneys and instructed the jury. Then they filed out. 12 strangers carrying the weight of all our sleepless nights. Time moved differently after that. The courtroom emptied. Reporters whispered in the hall. Emily and I waited in a small side room. watching the sun climb higher through the narrow window. She turned the rosary beads in her fingers, something she hadn't done since she was a child. "Mom," she said quietly, "I used to think strength meant never breaking. Now, I think it's knowing how to heal." I reached for her hand. Healing is the hardest kind of strength. After 2 hours, the bailiff knocked. "They've reached a verdict." The courtroom filled again. Slower this time. Heavier. The jury filed in. Faces solemn. The foreman stood, a folded paper in his hand. "In the matter of Chestnut versus Ramirez," he began, "we find the defendant, Benjamin Ramirez, guilty of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional deception." A murmur rolled through the room. The judge's gavel brought silence. "The court hereby sentences the defendant to 7 years in state custody, with restitution to the Chestnut family and forfeiture of all misappropriated assets." I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just let the words sink into me. Slow and deep, like rain on dry ground. Emily's shoulders shook beside me. Ben turned toward us then, eyes wild. "Emily," he said, voice cracking, "you don't understand. I loved you." She stood. Her voice was calm. "No. Ben, you loved what you could take." The deputies led him away, the chains clinking faintly with each step. The sound was small, but final, the punctuation at the end of years of lies. When the doors closed behind him, I finally exhaled. Outside, sunlight poured over the courthouse steps. The crowd that had gathered broke into applause, soft at first, then swelling. Reporters shouted questions, but I didn't answer. I only looked at Emily, and she looked back at me with a tremulous smile that said everything words could not. We drove home in silence. The road wound through golden fields, the mango trees swaying under the afternoon wind. When the ranch came into view, the workers were standing by the gate, hats in hand. They cheered as we pulled in. Emily stepped out first. She looked around at the land, our land, and let out a breath that sounded like release. "It's really over," she whispered. "Yes," I said, "and it's just beginning." In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of life returned. The fields needed pruning. The shipments needed signing. Victor came by one morning with final paperwork. "The restitution is approved," he said. "The ranch is safe." I offered him coffee, and he smiled. "You never needed luck, Mrs. Chestnut, just time and truth." Emily took over more of the operations. She negotiated new contracts, modernized the books, even opened a scholarship fund for the workers' children. The same woman who once doubted her worth now stood in front of every meeting with confidence that came from surviving the worst and standing tall anyway. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned gold, she joined me on the porch. The air smelled of ripe fruit and dust. "Do you ever miss him?" she asked softly. I looked at the horizon. "I miss who I thought he was, but not who he became." She nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes I still hear his voice in my head, the way he used to make me feel small. But it fades a little more every day. That's how healing works," I said. "It doesn't erase the scars. It teaches you to wear them like armor." The crickets started singing. The workers' laughter drifted up from the fields. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel fragile. As the stars appeared, Emily leaned against my shoulder. "Mom," she said, "thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't see the truth." I smiled and kissed the top of her head. "That's what mothers do. We stand in the fire until the light comes back." She squeezed my hand. "Then we build again." We sat there until the moon rose over the mango grove, casting silver light over the land that had almost been lost. The world was quiet, except for the rustle of trees, the same trees my father had planted. The same trees Emily would one day teach her children to care for. Justice had come and gone, but redemption real. quiet redemption was still unfolding. Row by row, season by season. I closed my eyes, breathed in the scent of the earth, and whispered a single prayer. Let this peace last.